1970 in the Yorkshire Dales, and a series of recent fatal accidents had pushed British cave diving to yet another crisis point. Diver Mike Wooding felt that a change of attitude was needed. He approached diving in a more methodical and philosophical way than most of his contemporaries. His gear was well thought out and meticulously maintained. 2 new back-mounted 40 cubic foot bottles gave him nearly 4 times the air duration that most cave divers carried. In a site like Keld Head in Kingsdale, he felt that only one thing now could stop him diving much further in than anyone else had so far achieved. Consciously suppressing his fear, Mike pushed over 1,000 feet into Keld Head's flooded passages, the longest dive yet achieved in Britain. Sadly, only a few months later, Wooding had to stop diving because of the after effects of a motorcycle accident. A gap was left. Diving in the Yorkshire Dales almost came to a halt for 3 years. Then in September 1973, 2 cavers from the Kendal Caving Club with little previous diving experience arrived at Boreham Cave in Littondale. The Morris Minor belonged to Jeff Yeadon, and his companion was ex-public school boy Oliver Statham, known to his friends as Bear.
We'd both done a little bit of training. I'd trained down at Bristol University in the pool there, and Bear had read the US Divers Manual 2 or 3 times. And then we'd gone out and bought a bit of equipment. Looking back, we were really looking for an accident. We set off into the sump, and it was the easiest sump imaginable really, because the visibility was so good. You could see the passage right out in front of you, and I was quite relaxed in the sump.
Bear was diving with a single valve. His spare valve was in the metal box that he carried.
Suddenly, Bear's face appeared right at the front of my mask, and he looked to be having a few problems. He pointed quickly at his mouthpiece, and while I was trying to interpret this, he shot off past me over my left shoulder, and the last thing I saw of him were a pair of flippers wagging furiously and then the mud stirring up behind him. So I followed on behind as quickly as I could. I realised there must be something wrong with his breathing apparatus.
Statham's valve had failed catastrophically. When he passed Yeadon, he had 90 feet to swim on one snatched half mouthful of air before he could surface.
He was lucky to be alive. Later that day he decided that he'd had enough of cave diving. It was far too dangerous and he was going to take up something a little safer. In fact, he took up hang gliding.
Yeadon, however, was not one to be so easily put off. He decided to carry on exploration alone. He soon had passed Sump 1 and was faced with the unexplored Sump 2. Now to continue would require tremendous strength of character. Month by month, Yeadon built up both his skill and his courage to push ever further on into the unknown.
By February I'd reached a point 900 feet into the cave and was going in ready to lay more line to push on further. And it was my first exploratory dive. Every time I went a bit further I found it was playing more and more on my nerves. Even though I had line to lay out and the passage was clear in front and I had plenty of air, I was always looking for a reason to turn back, but I couldn't find one. When I got to my furthest point, I found that the line continued, and it was a different colour. To begin with, I didn't believe it, but I followed on, and 50 feet further on, the line surfaced in airspace, and the stream was roaring down through boulders in front of me. Someone had obviously beaten me to it.
Not only had another diver leapfrogged Eden, but he had broken into a large open passage, which appeared to be spectacular. Now, alone, totally isolated, enormously frustrated, and yet still triumphant, it's difficult to imagine the turmoil going on in Jeff's mind. In a trance, he set out to investigate the new passage that he felt should have been his to explore. Perhaps his rival had missed something.
On the way back, I noticed a large tunnel high up in the roof, and I decided that it was worth a try to try and climb the 40 feet of sheer face up into that tunnel. If I'd fallen, there would have been nobody to get me out. I would have just perished.
To attempt such a climb in a place like this was a huge risk, but the rewards were to be spectacular.
The tunnel was just like a jewel box in front. There were straw stalactites that came right down from roof to floor. I've got this memory of tinkling glass just being broken and falling to the ground all around me. I felt like a bull in a china shop. About 300 feet further forward, things got even better as I approached the edge of quite a large lake.
The china shop was unique. Nothing quite like it had ever been seen in Britain before. Who was it then that had robbed Eden of that first, much-deserved breakthrough? The divers concerned had travelled up from the limestone areas of South Wales. Martyn Farrs, the leader, was a diver hungry for promising new sites to explore anywhere in Britain.
During the early 1970s, there were SEMPs right around the country in all the cave-in regions that obviously had not been fully pushed to any real conclusion. And obviously the more important of them, the more promising of them, were of interest to people like myself. And all too often you look at a promising something, you think, yeah, I'd like to have a trip in there, and you found that somebody else had set their stamp on it. They sort of got it reserved. And they mightn't have been to that site for perhaps 12 or 18 months. So there's a prime site waiting to be explored and you can't get at it.
In South Wales too, this more aggressive approach to cave diving was to bring Farrs into conflict with another diver. In the spring of 1974, Farrs set his sights on a cave system called Agon-Athwyd, where another diver, John Parker, had been working for some time. Parker had reached Sump 3. Farrs hoped that he might be able to push it further.
In May, I managed to pass John Parker's limit with no problem at all, and then just 100 feet later, about 1,300 feet of diving from base, I broke surface into this huge passage that just disappeared off into the darkness. It was the sort of passage that all cave divers dream of finding. So I quickly dropped the kit and raced off down this passage to see where it went, and it was absolutely enormous. Finally, 500 metres from the start of the dry passage, the route started to dip, and just around the corner, it was inevitable that sooner or later there would be a sump.
Realising now that once word got out, Parker might try to leapfrog him, Farrs immediately made plans to dive Sump 4, this time with his diving partner, Roger Solari. Solari was younger and less experienced than Farrs, but was no less eager to experience that unique thrill of new discovery. Roger would lead off first, laying his 400 feet of diving line as he went.
We decided that for the first time ever in our partnership, we would dive this together. Eventually, his reel ran out, so I knew we were 400 feet into the dive. I knew Roger also had a little bit less air in his bottles than mine, so I consulted my pressure gauge, and that had already was just about to reach the third limit, so I knew that within another couple of minutes I really should be starting back out. We communicated underwater that I was going to carry on, and that if he was at all uncertain, Roger should head off back out. I carried on, knowing full well that I was conducting a solo exploration now. But 150 feet later, there in front of me was a steep gravel bank heading upwards. And I looked at my pressure gauge again, and that confirmed that yes, I was well into my second third of air, and that if I carried on, this really was rather a rash gamble. Eventually, I was down at about 3 feet depth. I knew I was just under the water's surface, but could I find any air? There was just no air anywhere. As I turned round to make my way back out, the unthinkable occurred, and there was Roger above me on the roof of the passage at 3 feet depth. And I swam up to him, and he didn't have to. Well, we communicated again quite clearly underwater. I said to him quite clearly, we've got to go. We've got to get out of here now. I sped off down the line in front of him, so we were both desperately low on air. But the instant I actually broke surface as well, I mean, absolutely incredible relief, obviously, that I'd made it back to an air surface. So I stood there in the pool and developed an incredible headache from the reality of the situation, with the full shock of the preceding sort of half hour to events. So it hadn't really dawned on me yet. When eventually I realised there was no sign of Roger, the only thing I could do then was just to sit down and wait. That period of waiting, absolutely. Again, almost indescribable, the thoughts that go through your head when you think of what could have happened and what probably had happened.
Tragically, Roger Solari would never return. Could it be that this new sense of competition between cave divers was a dangerous development? And yet the story was not yet over. At Wookey Hole, the birthplace of cave diving, progress had been slow. In 1970, John Parker and Colin Edmonds had pushed beyond Chamber 22. The way on plunged deep again. There was a pause. Jeff Yeadon saw a way to get his own back for Bowen Cave, with his old partner, Oliver Bear Statham.
After the success at Boreham Cave, they decided to take up cave diving again, and we began diving as a team. In 1976, we were invited to dive at Wookey Hole in Somerset. On the morning of our intended dive, we were surprised to find that Farr and Edmonds had just emerged from the cave, having heard of our possible attempt to push the cave further, and they had been in before with a similar intention. This made us even more determined to put them to the post. We arrived at Chamber 22, 1,000 feet into the cave, to find their line going off into the next sump. But it might easily have gone down again rather than surface. As it happened, we were lucky on that day, and it surfaced.
It seemed like some strange sort of poetic justice. Jeff and Bear had chanced upon the most significant breakthrough in Wookey Hole for many years.
As we traversed up this terrific streamway, which must contain the full force of the River Axe, and in places we were up to 60 feet high, we realised we'd come upon the biggest discovery that had ever been made at Wookey Hole. On top of our feelings of terrific excitement, there was also the added spice that we'd beaten far to it, and it was, in a way, revenge for the extensions at Boreham Cave.
Farr was quick to respond. He soon found that Sump 24 plunged to depths that would require new deep diving techniques and decompression stops to avoid getting the bends. In 1977, Farrs took on the challenge, with television cameras recording the event.
Well, this thing continually or constantly monitors what the diver is doing underwater. It gives a dive time here in minutes when you're underwater, and then when you get out to the other side, it tells you how much residual nitrogen you've got left in your body. On here, it tells you the hypothetical time it would take you to ascend if you were in the sea. Obviously, that's not much use to us here. It gives a constant readout of your depth. It tells you the first decompression depth that you need to stop at and the length of time that you need to stop at that depth. So all in all, it should be an extremely useful instrument.
There was to be no big breakthrough, but the 150-foot depth that Farrs had reached had set a new British cave diving depth record, and that was enough in itself to justify the champagne reception. But cave diving at Wookey had clearly entered a new and challenging phase. In Yorkshire, Geoff Eden and Oliver Statham were also making great strides in Keld Head, and were a long way beyond Wooding's old limits. They had invited Jochen Hassenmeyer, a German cave diver reckoned to be the best in Europe at that time, to join them. His equipment was impressive, and with his help, they felt they could also get into the record books. They planned to set off at half-hour intervals, with Hassenmeyer first, and with Eden bringing up the rear. They carried enormous tanks of air to enable them to stay underwater for as long as 4 hours.
From my own point of view, the dive went quite smoothly, right the way up to 2,700 feet into the cave, where I saw another diver coming towards me. I expected it to be Jochen, but it turned out to be Bear, which gave me quite a surprise, because Jochen by then had been in over an hour longer than I had. Bear indicated that he wanted to write on my slate, as that was the only means we had to communicate. When I came to look at the slate, it said, "No Jochen, question mark, trouble, question mark, exclamation mark." And a shudder went right through me. I had to pause for a while before I replied in writing to him, "I will go and look, but then turn back." Bear then left, and I carried on into the cave. Knowing that I was going to meet something unpleasant up front, tension began to build up inside me. I arrived at this small opening 3,000 feet into the cave. I could see the guideline going into a narrow crevice round to the right. I began to feel tugs on the guideline. Obviously it was Jochen. So I tugged back to let him know that I was there. 2 lights gradually appeared out of the gloom. It was Jochen with his head on one side because he wouldn't fit through the other way around. I waited there a few minutes longer and then decided that I'd have to check how much air I got left. As I was checking my air, 50 feet back down the tunnel, I still had some time left, so I went back to the opening to act as a lighthouse for Jochen. He suddenly reappeared at a little hole to my right. An outstretched arm came out of the hole, so I grabbed his hand and I could feel the either fear or nervous energy coming through his hand. So I gently squeezed his hand to try and give him the idea that I was all right. Then he patted me on the back of the hand with his other hand and gave a quick wave goodbye. At that point I either thought, well, he's sorted himself out, or he's doing a Captain Oates and saying, leave me. Eventually, after some more minutes, he reappeared at the right hole, and this time it was clear he was going to be able to get out. When he came out of the hole, I assumed that he was going to be very low on air. I'd read stories about divers attacking each other for air in other caves. As it happened, he seemed quite composed, so I indicated for him to go out first. Then I followed on behind him, and all the time I just could hardly contain myself for wondering what had happened to him and if he was going to get out, because we still had an hour's swim to the entrance.
When he emerged, Jochen insisted that he'd not really been in trouble. Nevertheless, when Jeff asked to see how much air he had left, Jochen refused. Although Hassenmeyer denied it, it had been a very close thing indeed, and Yeaton knew it. Throughout the coming year, Jeff and Bear persisted with their diving and exploration at Keld Head, continually refining both diving and line-laying techniques. Finally, in January 1979, they were ready for the record books. They had completed an underwater connection between the passages of the Kingsdale Master Cave and where the water emerged at Keld Head. The complete swim through, from cave to rising, would be a distance of 6,000 feet, a world record. They are merged into the winter night, to waiting friends, to TV cameras, and to champagne.
Can they drink champagne with the masks on?
Yet as ever in cave diving, one big step forward seems soon to be followed by a step backward. Only months after the event, in a fit of depression, Oliver Bear Statham took his own life. Sometimes a goal achieved leaves a vacuum in its wake. Then, only a year later, Ian Plant, editor of the local paper, and another of Jeff's closest friends, became trapped and drowned while cave diving. Jeff came close to giving up diving.
You feel for a time that it can't be worth it, losing good friends, but you know that they wouldn't have wanted you to stop, and I find that a way of not getting too emotionally involved with a death is to try and find out what went wrong and try and put it right. There's always a reason why a death's occurred, and cave diving is a kind of an activity where you have to analyse all the dangers that you can identify and try and protect yourself against these dangers. So in doing that you hope to make it a safer activity.
In spite of such tragic accidents, there's always someone ready to adapt the latest technology to push the limits of cave diving forward. Rob Parker is preparing for a dangerous and very significant dive at Wookey Hole.
Okay, Rob, you're leaving surface now.
He will use a new and sophisticated rebreathing set that lets him breathe a mixture of oxygen, helium and nitrogen to give a longer diving time at depth.
How you doing? Fine. Everything okay? Yeah, fantastic. We've broken the record, although unfortunately I couldn't find the way on. I got down to the present limit of exploration at minus 60 metres and pushed on through the squeeze, and it just closed down completely.
As far as the exploration of Wookey is concerned, the dive is a big disappointment. A narrow constriction at over 200-foot depth, on the face of it, seems impassable. But in terms of equipment, it could hold a big step forward in cave diving.
Cave diving is really in its infancy, and what we're seeing now is a swing back to using multi-gas rebreathers. What this means is it allows divers to spend longer and go to much greater depths, and it's reducing some of the problems we've had with decompression up to now. And on a world scale, people are going to be swimming miles into cave systems as opposed to just a few kilometres. It's going to be tremendous in the future. And what is going to happen over the next 10 years is it's going to seem like what we're doing now is child's play.
Nevertheless, the soul of the cave diving group remains here, beneath the limestone landscapes of Britain. In 30 years, cave diving has transformed the horizons of cave exploration beneath these hills. In the 70s, it was proposed that the major caves in the 3 counties of Yorkshire, Lancashire and Cumbria could be linked, a potential network of over 100 miles of cave passage. It seemed fanciful. Then over the years, one by one, the vital links started to be made, most of them by diving. In February 1989, as this film series nears completion, Jeff Yeadon and a new diving partner, Ian Watson, decide to attempt the closure of one of the remaining links in the 3 counties system. The underwater link between Gavel Pot and Pippikin Pot has been proved by dive tracing, but nobody has yet made the connecting dive. The winter weather promises good visibility in the sump, but the dive site is difficult to reach. British cave diving has made its mark in difficult locations, awkward muddy passages and constricted sumps with almost zero visibility. That surely is its cornerstone. What it has achieved, often at great cost, may seem irrelevant to many, but this is surely exploration at its purest and for its own sake. At the bottom of a draughty cold shaft, next to an even colder uninviting pool, Jeff and Ian kit up. It's the end of a difficult carry, and now everything focuses on them. For most of us, fellow cavers, filmmakers, there can be little to do now but shiver and prepare for a long wait. Underwater, the divers first film one another before the true exploration begins. During the cold of the following 2 hours, the possibility of an accident is always there to some extent in the back of the minds of those who wait. Eventually they return safely, but the link has not quite been made.
Well, we got to the furthest point that Ian had reached before, which was half a mile in and in 70 foot of water, and from there on the passage got a lot smaller and muddier. Now I reckon we may be within 300 feet of the Pippikin end now, but it's going to be a slow job.
It will need a return visit on May the 14th before the 2 caves are finally joined. It brings the total length of linked passages up to 47 miles, the longest cave system in Britain. There will be no newspaper headlines, no letter from the Queen, and for the most part only cavers will realise the significance of the connection. Nevertheless, one more piece can be placed in the jigsaw, which helps us to understand those secret rivers that flow beneath our English landscape.